Britain is tightening its borders, and it is doing it under a Labour government. That matters, because Labour is supposed to be the party many people assume would take a softer line on immigration. But that is not what is happening. The line is getting harder. The rules are getting tighter, and the politics behind it run deeper than most people think. This is not just about immigration. It is about political control, state credibility, and a government trying to prove that it can still govern a country that feels under pressure. Let's start with the first misconception. Labour did not come into office promising open borders. Even in its 2024 manifesto, Labour framed secure borders as one of the foundations of government, alongside economic stability and national security. So the idea that Labour has suddenly changed from one extreme to another is too simplistic. What has changed is the pressure and the speed of the response. Once Labour entered government, it inherited a country where immigration had already become one of the most politically sensitive issues in public life. The numbers tell part of the story. Official UK statistics show net migration fell sharply to 204,000 in the year ending June 2025, down from 649,000 a year earlier. So this is not a story of migration endlessly rising in a straight line. But politics does not move only on data. It moves on public feeling. And public feeling was still highly charged. Ipsos found in August 2025 that immigration was the top issue facing Britain, with 48% naming it as an important national issue. The same polling found 42% thought Labour was doing a worse job on immigration than the Conservatives. That is the political trap. Even when the numbers begin moving down, voters may still think the government is not in control. And once voters think that, the issue stops being technical. It becomes symbolic. Immigration becomes a test of whether the state can enforce rules, whether government can manage pressure, whether politicians can draw lines and hold them. And that is where Reform UK enters the picture. Reform did not just rise by talking about immigration. It rose by turning immigration into a broader argument about national control, elite failure, and political betrayal. After Reform's gains in the 2025 local elections, Reuters reported that Keir Starmer was under pressure to cut migration more aggressively. That pressure was not abstract. It was electoral. And later in 2025, YouGov found that 44% of Britons thought Reform was doing the most to set the political agenda. Only 14% said that about Labour. Even among Labour voters, Reform was seen as having more influence over the political conversation than the government. That is a dangerous position for any governing party. Because once your opponent defines the issue, you start governing reactively. You stop asking what policy is ideal. You start asking what weakness looks like. So, Labour moved. And it moved in ways that were clearly designed to signal control. In May 2025, the government's immigration white paper proposed lifting the skilled worker threshold back to graduate level. It also said salary thresholds would rise. And it abolished the immigration salary list that had allowed discounted thresholds in some occupations. The same package aimed to end reliance on overseas labour and grow the domestic workforce. That language matters, because this was not being sold as anti-migrant rhetoric. It was being sold as economic restructuring. Then came more tightening. Reuters reported the government would end overseas recruitment of care workers, shorten the post-study graduate route to 18 months, toughen English language requirements, and make the normal path to settlement 10 years instead of 5. It also planned a 32% increase in the immigration skills charge on employers hiring from abroad. In other words, Labour was not just trying to reduce irregular migration. It was making legal migration more selective, more conditional, and more expensive. And in March 2026, the government went even further. Reuters reported Britain imposed an emergency brake, blocking study visas for nationals of Afghanistan, Cameroon, Myanmar and Sudan, and halted work visas for Afghans, saying it wanted to curb asylum claims coming through legal routes. So this is not one isolated reform. It is a pattern of narrowing routes, raising thresholds, increasing conditions, and demonstrating that permission to enter, stay, or settle in Britain is becoming more controlled. Now ask the deeper question: why would Labour do this? Part of the answer is electoral competition. Reform UK has made immigration one of the central pressure points in British politics. A Labour government that looks permissive risks being portrayed as weak, detached, and incapable of defending the border. But that is not the whole answer. There is also a governing logic behind it. Britain is dealing with pressure on housing, pressure on public services, pressure on wages in parts of the labour market, and pressure on political trust. In that environment, immigration policy becomes less about moral language and more about system management. Governments start asking, how much demand can the system absorb? How much dependence on overseas labour is politically sustainable? How much room is there for openness when voters already think the country is overstretched? That is why this is bigger than Labour, and bigger than Britain. Across Europe, mainstream parties, including centre-left governments, have been hardening migration policy when they feel pressure from anti-immigration challengers or fear a collapse in public confidence. Reuters has reported similar moves in Denmark and Germany, and a wider European tightening of asylum and migration rules. So Britain is not an exception. It is part of a wider shift. What used to be framed mainly as a humanitarian or economic question is now being framed as a question of state capacity, of political legitimacy, of whether democratic governments can still enforce limits without losing control of the debate to parties further to the right. That is the real story. Britain is tightening borders under Labour, not because Labour has suddenly abandoned all its instincts, but because the political centre now believes that looking weak on borders is more dangerous than looking tough. And once that calculation changes, policy changes with it. Not just on illegal entry, but on student routes, work routes, settlement, deportation, and the overall meaning of who gets to stay. So yes, this is about immigration. But more than that, it is about what happens when border control becomes a test of whether the state is still in charge. And that is why the real question is not just why Britain is tightening its borders. The real question is why so many governments now believe they have no political choice but to do it.